This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
That is, man lived before he came to this earth. He is an eternal being. Joseph Smith gave to the world the true understanding of the origin of man, that man comes to earth with a divine and eternal purpose.
Let's examine the doctrine.
And through it, all who believe and obey the glorious gospel of God, all who are true and faithful and overcome the world, all who suffer for Christ and his word,
all of it.
All shall become as their Maker and sit with him on his throne and reign with him forever in everlasting glory.
And see what it has to offer.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished and love of God and neighbor rules the world. In the name of Jesus Christ.
What can be gleaned from Mormon teachings?
A corollary to the pernicious falsehood that God is dead is the equally pernicious doctrine that there is no devil. Satan himself is the father of both of these lies. To believe them is to surrender to him.
And where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you to become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 6 of the Naked Mormonism podcast. I'm Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Up to this point, I've released a backlog of 5 episodes which dealt with the history of some of the early people in the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This included a little bit about Joseph Smith himself, of course. The way that I want to construct the podcast is in kind of a linear storyline format, meaning I want to talk about things as they happen throughout a historical narrative. In addition to this, there will need to be entire episodes devoted to the introduction of each new important character as they come in. So far, the podcast has mainly been just that, introduction of significant people. The narrative itself hasn't even advanced into the translation of the plates into the Book of Mormon yet. So, I just really quickly wanted to give a thanks to David Michael with the My Book of Mormon podcast. I'm having a hard time getting started up and going, and as soon as he gave me a drop on his episode, episode 50 of My Book of Mormon podcast, man, my stats just instantly doubled, and now they're just doing so much better. So I just want to say, David Michael, you're awesome, and I love the work that you do, and really, really appreciate the shout out, man. Anyway, I guess we'll just jump into the episode here. Oh yeah, also, I did want to say that I have the Facebook page, Naked Mormonism, on Facebook, and Twitter pages up and running. I really haven't done a whole lot there, as it's only 5 episodes in. I'm recording the 6th episode right now, but I was hoping to get a little bit of the community's input on what's going on here, on how I'm doing on the podcast, if people like it or if people don't like it, if anybody has suggestions for how I could make it better or worse, preferably not worse. I'm really interested, so yeah, just let me know. Hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, or on my webpage, nakedmormonismpodcast.com. Anyway, I guess I'll just jump right into episode 6. Last episode, we introduced Oliver Cowdery. We called him Cowdung all over. This was Joe's right-hand man of action and counsel throughout the founding of the church. And at the end of that episode, I said that episode 6, this episode, would be the historical analysis of David Whitmer, who is the next big hitter we need to know before we advance the narrative into the translation. Well, Unfortunately, I became sidetracked in my research for David Whitmer by the massive PR shitstorm that the LDS Church is dealing with right now. I'm, of course, referring to the essay they released addressing Joseph Smith's 30 to 40 plural wives in Ohio and Illinois, which has caught some recent news coverage. Up to this point, the church has been as opaque as possible with the history surrounding Joe's harem. Even missionaries are taught to try and derail conversations that will eventually digress into Joe being a polygamist because they don't really have anything to say about it. This seems to be a complete about face on their previous policy, or, at least a bold evidence based stance to take on the issue with this release of the essay. While this may seem like a commendable action, this admittance is only happening amidst massive public dissension on evidence concerning Joe and his wives. They actually released 2 essays totaling almost 7,000 words on their own website, exclusively, late at night on October 22nd, 2014. In my humble opinion, I don't think they wanted the common press getting a hold of this, but I think they did want to have the information on their website in a convoluted manner just to satisfy prying eyes. So, let's see if it satisfies our prying eyes. This means we will be suspending the historical analysis for 2 episodes so we can analyze these essays they released. I really wanted to cover the entire polygamy issue at one time, but this is a good way to introduce us to the entire Mormon doctrine and stance on the issue. But after this, we'll dive back into the historical analysis with the introduction of David Whitmer, just as promised. But I do think it's necessary to occasionally do episodes like this whenever there are current events the church is involved in. I simply plan on reading both in their entirety and trying to make sense of it all. I'll be adding my, slightly abrasive commentary as usual, and possibly refuting some claims if at all necessary, and I'll also investigate important references they use if the claim seems to be outrageous or worthy of analysis. So the first essay they released was the Manifesto and the End of Plural Marriage, and the second one that they released is called Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. Now, the one that's catching all of the flack is Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo, whereas the first essay, that the Plural Marriage, is the second one. That's the one talking about Joseph Smith's 30 to 40 wives. However, the first essay that they released is called The Manifesto and the End of Plural Marriage, and that one doesn't talk about Joseph at all. So they released a second one as a complement or a supplement, I guess you could call it, to the first essay, in hopes that, I don't know, I guess they would avoid people saying, hey, you didn't include all the shit about Joseph. So, well, I kind of want to just read them both. So we're going to do the first essay this episode with an in-depth analysis, of course, and next episode is when I'll examine the second essay, and that's the one that talks about Joe, and we'll really, really, really dive into it deep. So let's just start it out. First essay. The Manifesto and the End of Plural Marriage, from the LDS.org website. Quote, for much of the 19th century, a significant number of the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practiced plural marriage, the marriage of one man to more than one woman. The beginning and end of the practice were directed by revelation through God's prophets. The initial command to practice plural marriage came through Joseph Smith, the founding prophet and the president of the church. That is the only mention of Joseph Smith in this entire essay. It continues, quote, in 1890, President Wilford Woodruff issued the Manifesto, which led to the end of plural marriage in the church. This actually had to be done because Utah was applying for statehood and was consistently denied amidst other political pressures. The government had even passed laws at the time making polygamy illegal, which carried up to an $800 fine and 5 years in prison. Now, $800 back then is an astronomical amount of money right now. This ended up with some of the members of the church who were practicing polygamy getting bounties placed on their heads. That makes for a pretty bad reputation when you're trying to get statehood, which amounted to the Mormon theocracy issuing this manifesto banning plural marriage. We'll actually read the manifesto momentarily when it becomes more pertinent. So the site continues, quote, the end of plural marriage required great faith and sometimes complicated, painful, and intensely personal decisions on the part of individual members and church leaders. Like the beginning of plural marriage in the church, the end of the practice was a process rather than a single event. Revelation came, quote, line upon line, precept upon precept, end quote. These, quote unquote, painful and intensely personal decisions that they talk about in that paragraph will come to light as we get further into the essay. It continues, quote, new section heading, Anti-Polygamy Laws and Civil Disobedience. For half a century, beginning in the early 1840s, church members viewed plural marriage as a commandment from God, an imperative that helped raise up a righteous posterity unto the Lord. Though not all church members were expected to enter into plural marriage, those who did so believed they would be blessed for their participation. And thus we see the problem with blind faith in one's leaders. This is not a singular occurrence throughout history. Revelations like this have come through people like Joseph Smith for a long time, because alpha male cult leaders often like to fuck lots of their followers, no matter who those followers are betrothed to. It continues, quote, between the 1850s and the 1880s, many Latter-day Saints lived in plural families, as husbands, wives, or children. Well, it also happened in the 1840s and even a fair amount in the late 1830s as the church was maturing. It's just that the evidence is a little less abundant for those occurrences, so the church won't readily admit to those ones yet. It continues, quote, in many parts of the world, polygamy was socially acceptable and legally permissible. Yeah. Primarily in third world countries or uncivilized places where that's been the tradition for generations. Not so much when you're talking about a civilized and staunchly religious Protestant sect that started as a grassroots movement from one, quote, prophet of God. The government didn't want to take a soft line with the Mormons because they were worried that their actions might set an example for the next crazy religious cult that wanted to, steamroll the government like the church had done up to this point. It continues, quote, but in the United States, most people thought that the practice was morally wrong. These objections led to legislative efforts to end polygamy. Beginning in 1862, the U.S. government passed a series of laws designed to force Latter-day Saints to relinquish plural marriage. In the face of these measures, Latter-day Saints maintained that plural marriage was a religious principle protected under the U.S. Constitution. The church mounted a vigorous legal defense all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Reynolds v. United States, 1879 case, the Supreme Court ruled against the Latter-day Saints. Religious beliefs was protected against law, religious practice was not. According to the court's opinion, marriage was a civil contract regulated by the state. Monogamy was the only form of marriage sanctioned by the state. Polygamy, the court explained, has always been odious among the northern and western nations of Europe. The more civilized parts, of course. Quote, the Latter-day Saints sincerely desired to be loyal citizens of the United States, which they considered a divinely founded nation. But they also accepted plural marriage as a commandment from God and believed the court was unjustly depriving them of their right to follow God's commandments. I want to voice my opinion on this. I don't know where all of you listeners tend to fall on the marriage equality issue, but I want to try and draw a parallel just so I can refute that parallel in just a second. These people were obviously fighting for their right to marry as they please, not unlike the LGBT movement is doing right now. So if men can marry men and women can marry women, what's to stop a guy from marrying a bunch of women? Or, flip it, a woman marrying a bunch of dudes? Well, I think adult consent is the hinge pin for marriage. Are both parties wanting to be married to each other, and is there a significant power difference in the situation? Meaning, is it a guy just wanting to marry his 14th 14-year-old, or are the two participants in the marriage essentially peers? This seems to refute any of the claims saying gay marriage is like legalizing pedophilia or bestiality, because that's simply absurd. And beyond that, to try and make the claim that marriage is for only one man and one woman is equally absurd. Love and marriage should be between consenting adults. That is the only requirement, and that requirement even allows for polyandry or polygamy, as long as all involved individuals are consenting adults, and, of course, there isn't a major power differential among the participants in the marriage, which is really, really hard to attain in a polygamist setting, like the fundamentalist Mormon church is familiar with. That's an easy criteria for successful marriages. Practically speaking, of course. It continues, quote, confronted with these contradictory allegiances, church leaders encouraged members to obey God rather than man. Many Latter-day Saints embarked on a course of civil disobedience during the 1880s by continuing to live in plural marriage and to enter into new plural marriages. The federal government responded by enacting ever more punishing legislation. Between 1850 and 1896, Utah was a territory of the U.S. government, which meant that federal officials in Washington, D.C. exercised great control over local matters. Goddamn government! Always overriding the power of small theocratic nation states. If only our government would do that today in a few states that almost fall under that theocracy description. It continues, quote, in 1882, the U.S. Congress passed the Edmonds Act, which made unlawful cohabitation, interpreted as a man living with more than one woman, punishable by 6 months of imprisonment and a $300 fine. In 1887, Congress passed the Edmonds-Tucker Act to punish the church itself, not just its members. The act dissolved the corporation of the church and directed that all church property over $50,000 be forfeited to the government. Which, $50,000 in that day, the only assets that the church possessed that were above that threshold at the time were the temples, where they sealed these polygamous marriages for time and all eternity. It continues, quote, this government opposition strengthened the saints' resolve to resist what they deemed to be unjust laws. Polygamous men went into hiding, sometimes for years at a time, moving from house to house and staying with friends and relatives. Others assumed aliases and moved to out-of-the-way places in southern Utah, Arizona, Canada, and Mexico, where they still reside to this day, actually. I recall a time when I was visiting Moab. Our family had to stop at the gas station in town. This is the gas station that isn't on the far southeast side, the huge Maverick gas station. This is the small Maverick gas station that's in the middle of town. I do remember seeing two large, cargo vans, Ford vans that fit 15 people at one time, sitting at one gas pump. And I clearly remember watching the kids come out of the store and pile into the vans. I asked my parents why they were dressed so funny. I was just fascinated that they were all in church clothes, but it wasn't even Sunday. Of course, I was 6, 7 years old at the time. That is actually when I heard about the doctrine of polygamy. And I remembering why is this such a big deal? It shouldn't matter. If only I would have known that probably half of the teenage girls that were walking out of the convenience store were betrothed to the one old motherfucker in his 50s that walked out of the store. I might have found it to be a little bit weird, but just at the time I didn't understand. Beyond that, I don't think my parents even told me that they were part of a breakoff sect of the church that we go to. I thought they just lived differently than us, and that was that. Simple. It continues, quote, many escaped prosecution. Many others, when arrested, pled guilty and submitted to fines and imprisonment. This anti-polygamy campaign created great disruption in the Mormon communities. The departure of husbands left wives and children to tend farms and businesses, causing incomes to drop and economic recession to set in. Yeah? When one guy is supporting 6 or more, or 12 or 15 or 30 families or whatever, and using the kids as slave labor, and he is suddenly removed from that picture, or taken to jail or whatever, it kind of fucks up all of the families that are involved and tied to that one old fucker. That's why the government doesn't want to go after polygamous colonies nowadays, because you basically orphan a bunch of kids and legally widow a bunch of women, a very simple means and no other way of life. That is a PR shitstorm for the government. Even though egregious sexual acts are committed to these teenage girls on a daily basis, they still don't do anything about it. I find it extremely frustrating. Quote, the campaign always strained families. New plural wives had to live apart from their husbands, their confidential marriages known only to a few. Pregnant women often chose to go into hiding, at times in remote locales, rather than risk being subpoenaed to testify in court against their husbands. Children lived in fear that their families would be broken up or that they would be forced to testify against their parents. Some children went into hiding and lived under assumed names. Despite countless difficulties, many Latter-day Saints were convinced that the anti-polygamy campaign was useful in accomplishing God's purpose. They testified that God was humbling and purifying his covenant people as he had done in ages past. Myron Tanner, a bishop of Provo, Utah, felt that, quote, the hand of oppression laid on the parents is doing more to convince our children of the truth of Mormonism than anything else we could have done, end quote. This is a perfect example of textbook Christian persecution complex. We see it in the Bible where it was founded. We see it back in the early Mormon church during their polygamy and many, many other times. And it's still happening today. I really, really wish I understood the social mechanism that spurs that false ego of the persecution complex into countless religious sects, because it's created so many problems for so many people. Quote, incarceration for conscience sake proved edifying for many. George Q. Cannon, a counselor in the first presidency, emerged from his 5 months in the Utah penitentiary rejuvenated. Quote, my cell has seemed a heavenly place, and I feel that angels have been there, unquote. That is a pretty fucking crazy holy man complex. This guy was in prison for 5 months because he was fucking teenagers, and he said that his jail cell was just another house of the Lord where angels visit? Such delusions of grandeur in a person lead civilized people to rationalize uncivilized things and hurt others in doing so. And this is no exception. In fact, this is a perfect example of it. Quote, the church completed and dedicated 2 temples during the anti-polygamy campaign, a remarkable achievement. There's the LDS evangelical model right there. Spread out further to consume more resources and more souls, no matter what else is going on in the world or who is against you. And it's so far worked because they boast a membership of 15 plus million members right now, which we'll talk about later. But still, it continues, quote, but as federal pressure intensified, many essential aspects of the church government were severely curtailed, and civil disobedience looked increasingly untenable as a long-term solution. You think? Between 1885 and 1889, most apostles and stake presidents were in hiding or in prison. After federal agents began seizing church property in accordance with the Edmonds-Tucker Act legislation, management of the church became more difficult. New section, the Manifesto. After 2 decades of seeking either to negotiate a change in the law or avoid its disastrous consequences, church leaders began to investigate alternative responses. In 1885 and 1886, they established settlements in Mexico and Canada, outside the jurisdiction of the U.S. law, where polygamous families could live peaceably. Hoping that a moderation in their position would lead to a reduction in hostilities, church leaders advised plural husbands to live openly with only one of their wives, and advocated that plural marriage not be taught publicly. I have to ask, if God is commanding a person to do something, and then makes it impossible to do that thing in a legal manner, don't you think God would have seen that coming and would know what to do ahead of time so they could still practice their God-given polygamy and not get harassed by the government? I mean, just because you're being persecuted by the government doesn't mean you're doing the right thing. So many cults have this wrong. Or that you're part of the right group even. The same goes for evidence and facts. You don't get to say the facts don't matter because your church is true, and by default, everything that isn't from the church is false. You can't say that. We're all human beings, and we all have to play by the same rules down here, and if you can't follow the rules of a given society, then you don't belong in that society. That's why you were denied statehood for so long. I digress. Anyway, back to it. Quote, in 1889, the church authorities prohibited the performance of new plural marriages in Utah. Church leaders prayerfully sought guidance from the Lord and struggled to understand what they should do. Both Presidents John Taylor and President Wilford Woodruff felt the Lord directing them to stay the course and not renounce plural marriage. Now, when it says President John Taylor and President Wilford Woodruff, that's just typical Mormon jargon. John Taylor was the prophet and president of the church up until 1887, but Wilford Woodruff was in the first presidency of the church up to that point and only became the actual prophet/president when John Taylor died. But it refers to both of them as president because anybody that has ever been in the first presidency of the apostles gains the title of president, whether they are a prophet or not, or ever become a prophet. But it just so happens that Wilford Woodruff becomes the prophet after John Taylor, which he is the actual person that releases the manifesto. It continues, quote, "This inspiration came when paths for legal redress were still open. The last of the paths closed in May 1890 when the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the Edmonds-Tucker Act, allowing the confiscation of church property to proceed. President Woodruff saw that the church's temples and its ordinances were now at risk. Burdened by this threat, he prayed intensely over the matter. Quote, 'The Lord showed me by vision and revelation exactly what would take place if we did not stop this practice.' He is referring to plural marriage, of course. Quote, 'All the temples would go out of our hands. God has told me exactly what to do and what the result would be if we did not do it.' End quote. On September 25, 1890, President Woodruff wrote in his journal that he was, quote, 'under the necessity of acting for the temporal salvation of the church,' end quote. He stated, quote, 'After praying to the Lord and feeling inspired by his Spirit, I have issued a proclamation,' end quote. This proclamation, now published in the Doctrine and Covenants as Official Declaration 1, was released to the public on September 25th and became known as the Manifesto. So, how about we just read the manifesto right now? It's only like 5 paragraphs and it sums up everything really nicely for us. Manifesto, written by the hand of Wilford Woodruff and ratified by the church. Quote, 'To whom it may concern. Press dispatches have been sent for political purposes from Salt Lake City, which have been widely published to the effect that the Utah Commission, in their recent report to the Secretary of the Interior, allege that plural marriages are still being solemnized, and that 40 or more such marriages have been contracted in Utah since last June or during the past year. Also, that in public discourses, the leaders of the church have taught, encouraged, and urged the continuance of the practice of polygamy. I, therefore, as President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, do hereby in the most solemn manner declare that these charges are false. We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriages, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice, and I deny that either 40 or any other number of plural marriages have during that period been solemnized in our temples or in any other place in the territory. One case has been reported in which the parties allege that the marriage was performed in the endowment house in Salt Lake City in the spring of 1889, but I have not been able to learn who performed the ceremony. Whatever was done in this matter was without my knowledge. In consequence of this alleged occurrence, the endowment house was, by my instructions, taken down without delay. So Wilford Woodruff here is basically saying, you guys have been accusing us of polygamy. Well, I'm hereby declaring for everybody that it's all false. Everything, all of it, it's all false. We don't marry lots and lots of chicks around here. I promise we don't. I promise. Well, none have come to my attention anyway. I mean, how many times have we heard that by a public official? And then it even goes on to say, one case has been reported, but, I don't know who did it, so, once I learned about it, of course, I kicked the person out, and, the endowment house was taken down by my instructions that they did the ceremony in. I mean, it's so clear. It's just a PR bullshit letter. That's all it is. It's so blatantly clear. 2 paragraphs left. Quote, "Inasmuch as laws have been enacted by Congress forbidding plural marriages, which laws have been pronounced constitutional by the court of last resort, I hereby declare my intention to submit to those laws, and to use my influence with the members of the church over which I preside to have them do likewise. There is nothing in my teachings to the church or in those of my associations during the time specified which can be reasonably construed to inculcate or encourage polygamy. And when any elder of the church has used language which appeared to convey any such teaching, he has been promptly reproved. And I now publicly declare that my advice to the Latter-day Saints is to refrain from contracting any marriage forbidden by the law of the land." Wilford Woodruff, President of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, signed. Isn't it funny how prompt the church is to receive a revelation from God at just the right time before something really, really bad happens? In fact, there have been a few times throughout Mormon history where they are holding to some socially unacceptable thing until somebody really, really puts the screws to them. Then suddenly, revelation from God comes to the prophet, or the entire quorum of the apostles in First Presidency, that they should change the exact thing they are doing wrong in order to stay away from social obscurity. It happened with polygamy in the 1890s, and that's why they released the manifesto. It happened with blacks in the priesthood in the 1970s, and then finally they could get the priesthood. And it just now happened on October 22nd, 2014, as the facts surrounding Joseph's plural wives are becoming more abundant and irrefutable. Speaking of, let's continue reading the essay they released. Quote, "The members of the Quorum of the 12 varied in their reactions to the manifesto. Franklin D. Richards was sure it was the work of the Lord. Francis M. Lyman said that, quote, he had endorsed the manifesto fully when he had heard it, unquote. Not all the 12 accepted the document immediately. John W. Taylor said he did not yet feel quite right about it at first. John Henry Smith candidly admitted that, quote, the manifesto had disturbed his feelings very much, and that he was still somewhat at sea regarding it, unquote. Within a week, however, all members of the 12 voted to sustain the manifesto. The manifesto was formally presented to the church at the semi-annual General Conference held in the Salt Lake Tabernacle on October 1890. On Monday, October 6th, Orson F. Whitney, a Salt Lake City bishop, stood at the pulpit and read the Articles of Faith, which included the line that Latter-day Saints believe in obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. I know I remember memorizing the Articles of Faith, but I cannot remember which one that has it in. Maybe that's the fourth Article of Faith? I can't remember. Anyway, it continues, quote, these articles were sustained by uplifted hand. Whitney then read the manifesto, and Lorenzo Snow, president of the Quorum of the 12, moved that the document be accepted as authoritative and binding. The assembly was then asked to vote on this motion. The Deseret News reported that the vote was unanimous. Most voted in favor, though some abstained from voting. Rank and file Latter-day Saints accepted the manifesto with various degrees of reservation. Many were not ready for plural marriage to come to an end. General Relief Society President Zina D.H. Young, writing in her journal on the day the manifesto was presented to the church, captured the anguish of the moment. Today the hearts of all were tried, but looked to God and submitted. The manifesto prompted uncertainty about the future of some relationships. Eugenia Washburn Larson, fearing the worst, reported feeling dense darkness when she imagined herself and other wives and children being turned adrift by husbands. Other plural wives, however, reacted to the manifesto with great relief. So that was kind of a big piece to chew on. But I read that much in succession to get all of that useful information out about the Saints' reaction to this motion. I did that so we could kind of paint a proper picture of everything that was going on at the time. So try to picture yourself in early Utah, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s Utah, as part of a faithful Mormon polygamist family at the time, right? This was in only partially civilized, newly settled Utah. After the death of the founding prophet of the church, Joe, of course, Brigham Young led your family out here to the quote-unquote promised land. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Wasatch Front in Utah, where the pioneers first settled, but it's a very inhospitable place to try and settle a community. I can't figure out why they picked it. Even with the Rocky Mountain countryside becoming slightly civilized, there were still a lot of dangers surrounding the Saints, even through the 1890s when the manifesto was released. But this was God's promised land to all the Latter-day Saints? Native Americans were snatching supplies and stealing livestock. The Salt Lake Valley experienced hot summers and crop-destroying bitter cold winters that come really early in the year. The soil and climate are challenging and arid, and the biggest body of water that's nearby has a higher salt content than most oceans, rendering it useless for anything people actually need water for. Utah is classified as a desert. It even has unforgiving mountain passes, deadly weather, and dramatic resource famine at all times. Yet this was the place that God had set apart from everywhere else on the entire earth, through all time and space, for his true saints to live? It doesn't make sense. So, as challenging as it is to swallow the fact that you live in a shitty place, you live under the rule of a theocracy run by a man with direct conduit to God, and every member is each other's moral policeman. Things don't seem to get much worse than this, as we've seen throughout human history. Cults like this usually end up drinking potion or whatever. But you are a faithful member of the church. Not only are you faithful to the church, but you believe that Wilford Woodruff is the direct pipeline to the will of God, and whatever he says is what God truly wants to happen. You live in a polygamous family as the son or daughter of one of possibly, 13 other sister wives, headed by one faithful man that holds a leadership position in the church. You're essentially raised in a commune of your distant relatives by your distant relatives, without any sense of a proper, healthy family as we see it today. What you do see is your male cousins and brothers maturing to marital age and being kicked out of the family to save the good meat for the old fuckers, of course, and your female cousins and sisters being taken for wife by your father or his best buddies as soon as they mature. The entire structure of your family and everything in your environment is built on the single principle of massive family structures with a single head patriarch. Being everything you know, and the only reason you're in God-forsaken Utah to begin with, the church has shaped everything in your world to be how it currently is, and that includes a polygamous family structure. And one day, the prophet releases a statement saying that the church no longer practices polygamy. Think of the precarious situations that now abound. The structure of the entire society is broken down, and it doesn't have any short-term solution in sight for all those now orphan children and essentially widowed sister wives. It even said that itself in the essay that the church released, that quote-unquote civil disobedience wasn't considered a long-term solution. You know for a fact that your father will only take one of the families to stay with him, and will have to jettison the remaining wives and children to find another man to support them, or to be driven into homelessness, or into special support communes for remaining families, or, into another polygamous family, or whatever. Pick your horrible fate. It doesn't matter. The outcome is shitty no matter what way you look at it. So not only does your family get kicked out of this massive 3-story house that you've been living in for a long time, and it was packed wall to wall with children and wives and cousins and brothers and sisters and blah, 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 but you also have to move from place to place with your mother and possibly another sister wife or two and all your siblings until you find someone willing to take you in across town. And what's even worse than that is the next time you go to church, you see the polygamous family that lived down the street from you, still together and happy because they didn't follow the manifesto, nor did they consider the manifesto to be actual revelation from God. They just thought it was something Woodruff had released to get the government off the Saints Collective back. No matter what happened, all you know is none of it makes sense. Your family is torn apart, your mother is no longer being abused by your father, but she doesn't have a plan or any means of supporting everybody left in the aftermath. And you feel like everything that has happened is all part of the omnipotent God's master plan, because that's what everybody around you has said about the situation. Does this example serve at all to illustrate what life in the early Mormon church was like? I don't know what it is or how to classify what happened, but all I can say is, if God is responsible for this whole shindig going down, then that's a pretty stupid goddamn God. Could this God not foresee governmental opposition to his revealed command? Could this God not figure out that the church was going to have problems with the government when they tried to raise their own little theocracy in Utah? I'm sorry, but Elohim is not a god worthy of worship. Neither is Yahweh or Thor or Mithra or any of them. Is this the best Elohim can do? For the saints of the most perfect gospel, restored through the most perfect prophet that ever lived, those are simply characteristics of either an inept God or an absentee God. And I kind of think it was the latter of the two. It continues, quote, new section after the manifesto. Latter-day Saints believe that the Lord reveals His will, line upon line, here a little and there a little. Church members living in 1890 generally believed that the manifesto was the work of the Lord. Of course, there were exceptions, in Franklin D. Richards' words. But the full implications of the manifesto were not apparent at first. Its scope had to be worked out, and authorities differed on how to best proceed. We have been led to our present position by degrees, Apostle Heber J. Grant explained. Over time and through effort to receive continuing gospel, church members saw by degrees how to interpret the manifesto going forward. At first, many church leaders believed the manifesto merely suspended plural marriage for an indefinite time. Having lived, taught, and suffered for plural marriage for so long, it was difficult to imagine a world without it. George Buchanan, a counselor in the First Presidency, likened the manifesto to the Lord's reprieve from the command to build temples in Missouri in the 1830s after the saints were expelled from the state. In a sermon given immediately after the manifesto, sustained at General Conference, Cannon quoted a passage of Scripture in which the Lord excuses those who diligently seek to carry out a commandment from Him, only to be prevented by their enemies. Quote, behold, it behooveth me to require that work no more at the hands of those sons of men, but to accept of their offerings. End quote. Nevertheless, many practical matters had to be settled. The manifesto was silent on what existing plural families should do. On their own initiative, some couples separated or divorced as a result of the manifesto. Other husbands stopped cohabiting with all but one of their wives, but continued to provide financial and emotional support to all dependents. That is, if they were in a financial situation to do it, which almost never happened because everybody was so resource famine. It continues, quote, in closed-door meetings with local leaders, the First Presidency condemned men who left their wives by using the manifesto as an excuse. Quote, I did not, could not, and would not promise that you would desert your wives and children, end quote, President Woodruff told the men. This you cannot do in honor. So, let me get this straight. Woodruff issued the manifesto banning plural marriages. Then, when members of the church tried to divorce, citing the manifesto as the reason why, Woodruff condemned them for doing so. How butt-bucking bass-ackwards is that show bit? If God is not the author of confusion, like it states in 1 Corinthians 14, then He is sure doing a horrible job at following His own tenets, because this shit is confusing. Not just for us now looking back on it, but it must have been extremely confusing for the people that were actually involved with it during the time. It continues, quote, believing that the commandments they made with God and their spouses had to be honored above all else, many husbands, including church leaders, continue to cohabit with their plural wives and father children with them well into the 20th century. That's what I described in the little hypothetical earlier with the polygamous family that lived down the street that didn't break up, but your polygamous family did. Quote, continued cohabitation exposed those couples to the threat of prosecution, just as it did before the manifesto, but these threats were markedly diminished after 1890. The manifesto marked a new relationship with the federal government and the nation. Prosecution of polygamists declined, plural wives came out of hiding and assumed their married names, and husbands interacted more freely with their families, especially after U.S. President Benjamin Harrison granted general amnesty to Mormon polygamists in 1893. 3 years later, Utah became a state with a constitution that banned polygamy. So basically, the Mormons went on polygamy probation for like 3 years to prove to the government that they weren't a theocracy that practiced barbaric traditions, which resulted in official statehood for the Utah Territory in 1896. Quote, the manifesto declared President Woodruff's intention to submit to the laws of the United States. It said nothing about the laws of other nations. Ever since the opening of the colonies in Mexico and Canada, Church leaders had performed plural marriages in those countries, and after October 1890, plural marriages continued to be quietly performed there, and in southern Utah and Arizona, but those aren't mentioned. As a rule, these marriages were not promoted by church leaders and were difficult to get approved. Either one or both of the spouses who entered into these unions typically had to agree to remain in Canada or Mexico. Under exceptional circumstances, a smaller number of new plural marriages were performed in the United States between 1890 and 1904, though whether the marriages were authorized to have been performed within the states is unclear. I would really like to address this right now, but I'll save it for the full-out polygamy episodes when they come up in the storyline, as opposed to addressing it here in this little light version episodes of polygamy. Quote, the precise number of new plural marriages performed during these years, inside and outside the United States, is unknown. Sealing records kept during this period typically did not indicate whether a sealing was monogamous or plural, making an exhaustive calculation difficult. A rough sense of scale, however, can be seen in a chronological ledger of marriages and sealings kept by the church scribes. Between the late 1880s and the early 1900s, during a time when temples were few and travel to them was long and arduous, Latter-day Saint couples who lived far away from temples were permitted to be sealed in marriage outside them. I find this fascinating. The Mormon temples that you see up on hilltops and that dot the fruited plain of the Utah landscape exist for three basic reasons: baptisms for the dead, endowments, and marriage sealings. This literally constitutes 98% of the tasks that occur in the temple if you exclude, custodial and clerical work. If marriage sealings can be done outside of the temples and still be considered valid in the eyes of God, what other temple ordinances can be done outside of a temple? I personally would love to throw up a miniature version of a little veil that's in the temple in my front yard, made from plywood and chicken wire with like sheets draped over it and shit, just to do endowment ceremonies on my front yard for all to see outside of the bleached white walls of the temple. That may draw some attention, but at least the ritual would be valid in God's opinion, because he apparently doesn't actually care if Mormon ritual shit is done in a temple or not, as made abundantly apparent by these plural marriages that were sealed outside of the temple walls. I really hope that any never Mormon people that are listening became interested with that whole veil thing that I just described, because that's all part of the temple ceremonies we'll be covering when Joe ascends to a Master Freemason in our storyline. But it's way too much to jump into now. It continues, quote, the ledger of marriages and sealings performed outside the temple, which is not comprehensive, lists 315 marriages performed between October 17, 1890 and September 8, 1903. Of the 315 marriages recorded in the ledger, research indicates that 25 were plural marriages, that's 8%, and 290 were monogamous marriages, the other 92%. This is citing a historical document in the Church History Library. I don't have access to it, nor does the general internet public, so we can't actually verify the accuracy of this study without seeing the book in person. However, the LDS.org page that has this essay that we've been reading the whole time with its citation does expound a little bit on the topic when it mentions that. It's unclear how accurate the information is, as it was not a historical document that existed for the sole purpose of recording plural versus singular marriages. It only existed to document marriages that happened outside the confines of temple walls, and it even did fairly poorly at that. There was something that this essay says, referring to the historical document, that I really want to highlight. Honestly, I kind of find it disturbing. It's something it said at the beginning of this paragraph we just started reading. It said, quote, the ledger of marriages, which is not comprehensive, lists 315 marriages performed in a 13-year period. These are the only ones that we have positive proof of and can verify as plural or singular. The church readily admitted that there were marriages that were unaccounted for, and we truly can't know how many marriages were performed. Actually, some of the events that happened after the manifesto was voted on pretty well assure that multi-wifery abounded throughout Utah, Arizona, Idaho, Canada, and Mexico, and other places, and probably almost anywhere that had a concentration of isolated Mormons during that time. I wanted to point that out to illustrate that we need to research all sides of a claim when it's made, and I intend to do that when I dive further into polygamy, but we just can't get into it right now. It continues, quote, almost all the monogamous marriages recorded were performed in Arizona or Mexico. Of the 25 plural marriages, 18 took place in Mexico, 3 in Arizona, 2 in Utah, and 1 each in Colorado, and on a boat in the Pacific Ocean. A boat. Overall, the record shows that plural marriage was a declining practice and that church leaders were acting in good conscience to abide by the terms of the manifesto as they understood them. Apparently, it's all in the interpretation when it comes to God and divine revelation. Isn't it weird how that works? Quote, the exact process by which these marriages were approved remains unclear. For a time, post-manifesto plural marriages required the approval of a member of the First Presidency. There is no definitive evidence, however, that the decisions were made by the First Presidency as a whole. President Woodruff, for example, typically referred requests to allow new plural marriages to President Cannon for his personal consideration. President Woodruff became president in 1887, and he referred requests after 1890 to President George Q. Cannon to Wilford Woodruff just didn't want to deal with it anymore. He gave the manifesto to the government, and then anything that happened after that, he was just like, I'm washing my hands. I'm fucking out of here. You guys do whatever you want. I told what I said, and that's all, and we're going to get statehood soon, so just fucking deal with it, guys. Oh, yeah, and there were also 2 apostles that resigned because they considered polygamy holier than the manifesto that was released from Wilford Woodruff. Can an apostle do that? Growing up in the church, I never saw or knew of an apostle that resigned because of disagreements within the quorum. I didn't think that was a thing. I mean, they're all sustained as prophets, seers, and revelators twice a year by every Mormon that watches conference. So how the hell can there be any disagreements as to God's will? It makes no sense if they're all getting revelation from God. But yet these 2 guys resigned. We'll dive into that later too. Quote, by the late 1890s, at least some of the men who had authority to perform sealings apparently considered themselves free to either accept or reject requests at their own discretion. Independent of the First Presidency, Apostle Heber J. Grant, for example, reported that while visiting Mormon settlements in Mexico in 1900, he received 10 applications in a single day requesting plural marriages. He declined them all. Quote, I confess that it has always gone against my grain to have any violations of documents, i.e. the manifesto, of this kind. End quote. Oh shit, Fluffy's on a bender. Uh-oh. There's going to be Kitty peeling out on hardwood floor recorded in the background. I'm sorry. So, it just blatantly said that some of the apostles kind of took their own liberties to okay marriage with or without the approval of the rest of the quorum. Who was running this thing? Where was the peaceful accord among God's finest 15 people? Doesn't make any sense. It continues, quote, new section, the Second Manifesto. At first, the performance of new plural marriages after the manifesto was largely unknown to people outside the church. When discovered, these marriages troubled many Americans, especially after President George Q. Cannon stated in an 1899 interview with the New York Herald that new plural marriages might be performed in Canada and Mexico. After the election of B.H. Roberts, a member of the First Council of the 70 to the U.S. Congress, it became known that Roberts had 3 wives, one of whom he married after the manifesto. A petition of 7 million signatures demanded that Roberts not be seated. Congress complied and Roberts was barred from office. Well, we just voted Gordon goddamn Klingenschmidt to be Senator of Colorado here, but at least he doesn't have 3 wives simultaneously. I mean, 1 wife and a harem of concubines, there's no evidence for that, but he's a politician and that seems entirely possible. But at least He doesn't let the whole world know about it. B.H. Roberts probably had an agenda he was trying to push and didn't seem too apologetic about it, actively having 3 wives while he was running it, of course. It continues, quote, "The exclusion of B.H. Roberts opened Mormon marital practices to renewed scrutiny. Church President Lorenzo Snow issued a statement clarifying that new plural marriages had ceased in the church, and that the manifesto extended to all parts of the world. Counsel he repeated in private. Even so, a small number of new plural marriages continued to be performed, probably without President Snow's knowledge or approval. After Joseph F. Smith became church president in 1901, a small number of new plural marriages were also performed during the early years of his administration. He was probably just excited to stretch his new prophet legs and get a good old-fashioned daughter swap going with some of his pals." Quote, "The church's role in these marriages became a subject of intense debate after Reed Smoot, an apostle, was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1903. Although Smoot was a monogamist, his apostleship put his loyalty to the country under scrutiny. How could Smoot both hold up the laws of the church, some of whose officers had performed, consented to, or participated in the new plural marriages, and uphold the laws of the land, which made plural marriage illegal? For 4 years, legislators debated this question in lengthy public hearings. That's just what we love in Congress, fighting over meaningless dogshit personal topics and ignoring the big topics at hand. At least we can empathize with that nowadays." Quote, "The Senate called on many witnesses to testify. Church President Joseph F. Smith took the stand in the Senate chamber in March 1904. When asked, he defended his family relationships, telling the committee that he had cohabited with his wives and fathered children with them since 1890. He said it would be dishonorable of him to break the sacred covenants he had made with his wives and with God. When questioned about new plural marriages performed since 1890, President Smith carefully distinguished between actions sanctioned by the church and ratified in the church councils and conferences and the actions undertaken by individual members of the church. Quote, "There never has been a plural marriage by the consent or sanction or knowledge or approval of the church since the manifesto," he testified. In this legal setting, President Smith sought to protect the church while stating the truth. His testimony conveyed a distinction church leaders had long understood. The manifesto removed the divine command for the church collectively to sustain and defend plural marriage. It had not, up to this point, prohibited individuals from continuing to practice or perform plural marriage as a matter of religious conscience. So, not only were they blatantly ignoring the recommendation that was stated in the manifesto, but they considered it to be a hollow legal document that was simply brandished to get statehood. They continued practicing polygamy without remorse for years and decades after the manifesto, which was also against the state's constitution. I can't figure out why people didn't want them in Congress or the Senate. It just doesn't make any sense. Quote, "The time was right for a change in this understanding. A majority of Mormon marriages had always been monogamous, and a shift towards monogamy as the only approved form had long been underway. In 1889, a lifelong monogamist was called to the Quorum of the 12. After 1897, every new apostle called into the 12, with one exception, was a monogamist at the time of his appointment." That says nothing about his time after. Beginning in the 1890s, as church leaders urged members to remain in their native lands and build Zion in those places rather than immigrate to Utah as in previous years, it became important for them to abide the laws mandating monogamy. During his Senate testimony, President Smith promised publicly to clarify the church's position about plural marriage. At the April 1904 General Conference, President Joseph F. Smith issued a forceful statement known as the Second Manifesto. I'm going to clarify real quick. We're talking about Joseph F. Smith, not Joseph Smith, the original founder. Joseph F. Smith was a prophet later, and Joseph Fielding Smith was a prophet even later than that. Anyway, quote, "Attaching penalties to entering into plural marriage. If any officer or member of the church shall assume to solemnize or enter into any such marriage, he will be deemed in transgression against the church and will be liable to be dealt with according to the rules and regulations thereof and excommunicated therefrom. This statement had been approved by the leading councils of the church and was unanimously sustained at the conference as authoritative and binding on the church. The Second Manifesto was a watershed event. For the first time, church members were put on notice that new plural marriages stood unapproved by God and the church. New plural marriages. Quote, the Second Manifesto expanded the reach and scope of the first. Quote, when the manifesto was given, Elder Francis M. Lyman, president of the Quorum of the 12, explained, it simply gave notice to the saints that they need not enter plural marriage any longer, but the action taken at the conference held in Salt Lake City on the 6th day of April 1904 made the manifesto prohibitory. End quote. Fucking mazeballs. Once again, this was not a ban on polygamy, it only banned new polygamist marriages. That's the operating term. And any violator of the rule would go through the, quote, church tribunal to determine guilt, which was a total wink nod to anybody that still wanted to do it. Even better than that, it gave the leadership more control over who could have lots of wives. Also, any marriages that were currently active when the Second Manifesto came out were never annulled or dissolved. They were simply grandfathered in and still valid. So, anybody, whether they were a higher up in the church or just your average churchgoer that wanted another wife, could always just bump elbows with the apostles and whisper, hey, you're not going to tell the government on me, are you? Like, I'm cool, right? I can have another wife, right? And then that shit was done and swept under the rug, with liability resting equally on the shoulders of every polygamist man, because they were all in this little group watching each other's back. Well done, church. Well done. I have to admit, you guys got the government off your back, and funny factions of Mormonism still practice polygamy to this day because it's an eternal commandment of God that was never officially retracted by the church. It still perpetuates. That's why there are still Mormon fundy sects that practice polygamists. That's why. Simple. Continues, quote, church leaders acted to communicate the seriousness of this declaration to leaders and members at all levels. President Lyman sent letters to each member of the Quorum of the 12 by direction of the First Presidency, advising them that the Second Manifesto would be strictly enforced. Contrary to direction, two apostles, John W. Taylor and Matthias F. Cowley, continued to perform and encourage new plural marriages after the Second Manifesto. They were eventually dropped from the quorum. Taylor was later excommunicated from the church after he insisted on his right to continue to perform plural marriages. Cowley was restricted from using his priesthood and later admitted that he had been wholly in error. So these are the two apostles that quit that we talked about earlier, or were just, well, I don't know. They probably just got caught by the wrong person, or just fucked up somehow. And the other apostles didn't like him acting a fool, and they just sort of got the axe, I guess. Quote, some couples who entered into plural marriage between 1890 and 1904 separated after the Second Manifesto, but many others quietly cohabited into the 1930s and beyond. Up to today, church members who rejected the Second Manifesto and continued to publicly advocate plural marriage or undertake new plural marriages were summoned to the church disciplinary councils. Some who were excommunicated coalesced into independent movements and are sometimes called fundamentalists. These groups are not affiliated with or supported by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That was Warren Jeffs and his ilk, and there's lots of other factions too. Quote, since the administration of Joseph F. Smith, church presidents have repeatedly emphasized that the church and its members are no longer authorized to enter into plural marriage and have underscored the sincerity of their words by urging local leaders to bring non-compliant members before church disciplinary councils. That was vague and broad enough. The reality is, the LDS Church tries its damnedest to stay as far separated from the polygamous sects as it possibly can. Not only does the Church not bring members into these, quote, disciplinary councils, but instead tries to stay divorced from the fundies and wash its hands of the situation altogether. The Church wouldn't survive the PR nightmare of ripping polygamist families apart on national news, and they are well aware of that fact. There may be a small handful of these situations where disciplinary action was taken or has been taken or is even taken today. But that's not made public and we don't know. But, let's not kid ourselves, all right? The LDS Church prosecuted polygamy the same way the Catholic Church currently prosecutes priests that are butt-fucking little kids, which is to say, almost not at all. It continues, quote, new section in conclusion. Marriage between one man and one woman is God's standard for marriage unless he declares otherwise, which he did through his prophet Joseph Smith. This totally allows for plural marriage later on if the practice is ever considered socially acceptable. The only thing that would need to happen is the current prophet revelating the ban off of polygamy, and it could be done in an afternoon with the proper motivation and social allowances. Quote, the manifesto marked the beginning of the return to monogamy, which is the standard of the church today, even though it might not be tomorrow. Speaking at General Conference soon after the manifesto was given, President George Buchanan reflected on the revelatory process that brought the manifesto about. The presidency of the church have to walk just as you walk, he said. They have to take steps just as you take steps. They have to depend upon the revelations of God as they come to them. They cannot see the end from the beginning as the Lord does. All that we can do, Cannon said, speaking of the first presidency, is to seek the mind and will of God, and when that comes to us, though it may come in contact with every feeling that we have previously entertained, we have no option but to take the step that God points out and to trust Him. That was the end of the first of the two essays on plural marriage in the early church. Now, you may be asking why it didn't talk about Joseph Smith at all. It only mentioned him a couple of times. Well, me too. In fact, everybody was wondering that when the first essay was released. So the church almost immediately released the second essay, entitled Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. The first essay that we just finished reading has a lot of really good information and is cited well. However, I can't help but think there might be some information left out. This essay only talked about the manifesto and the practice of polygamy shortly leading up to and shortly after 1890. It only even hinted that there was marriage and polygamous marriages going on after the 1930s. Joe had been dead for over 45 years when this first manifesto was released. But the entire doctrine of polygamy was more or less his brainchild. I want to analyze the second essay way more than this one because it'll have some real dirt on Joe that the church has been hush-hushing or blatantly denying for so long. But this episode has gone on way too long and there's way too much information on the second essay to contain in this episode with its analysis. Luckily, the second essay is almost 900 words shorter than the first one, so it might not be quite as painful to go through with a fine-tooth comb. But anyway, that's it for today's episode, and I hope you enjoyed the information offered, even if it was kind of dry. I hope you join me next time for the full reading and analysis of the second essay, which is the one about Joseph Smith that's raised so much controversy in recent news. I still don't have very many subscribers, nor have I received much feedback on the show, but I'm really curious to see if all you listeners are enjoying what's here. I would really love some feedback or recommendations to make the show better. Just to let you know, I'll be jumping back into church history with David Whitmer in episode 8. So if that's what you are listening to the podcast for, please hang in there for a little bit longer because we're going to get back to the church history very soon. Also, hit me up on Facebook or Twitter or leave an iTunes rating, preferably positive, so the show can reach a more broad audience, only if you think the show is worthy of it, though. Anywho, thanks for listening, and I'll talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.